June 18, 1944. 0610 hours. Near Castel del Rio, Italy. The rising sun filtered through thin mountain fog and painted the ridgeline in uneven bands of light. The Italian campaign had entered another grinding phase. Mortar crews across the Allied line struggled with the same problems day after day. Terrain that looked flat on a map tilted in hidden angles. Valleys swallowed sound. Hills distorted distance. German scouts used this chaos to survive and to report artillery coordinates with deadly precision. Every missed round brought another risk for the men in the trenches who waited for support. Sergeant Thomas Miller moved along the mortar pit and studied the slope in front of him with quiet seriousness. He was in his early 30s, lean from farm labor, with eyes that scanned land the same way he once judged wheat rows. He grew up in rural Ohio and had spent his life walking fields, checking drainage lines, measuring feed, and deciding irrigation routes with nothing but a practiced sense of distance and angle. Farming demanded accuracy. It punished mistakes. That discipline followed him into war. His crew respected him. They trusted his judgment during heavy fire. They also noticed his unusual habit of kneeling in the dirt at dawn, drawing rough angles with sticks and pressing improvised markers into the ground. Standard military doctrine wanted mortarmen to follow firing tables, sight units, and pre-measured stakes. Doctrine worked on clean, open terrain. Italy was not clean. Ridges shifted in subtle curves. Small folds in the earth could cause shells to land 30 meters short. German forward observers used these hidden dips to vanish between each correction. Allied crews fired more to compensate and exposed their positions to counter-battery fire. Miller had seen too many wasted rounds. He had seen men suffer because the angle of a single mortar tube changed a fraction of a degree at the wrong moment. A few days earlier, a German scouting team built a hide near a broken stone wall. The Allied line spotted them, but mortar fire landed short. German artillery struck back 10 minutes later and left 2 Americans dead. Miller carried that memory. He kept replaying it in his mind as he tested new ways to read terrain. The tool that changed everything entered his life quietly. It was a discarded grain scoop he found near a supply point. Someone used it to unload animal feed months earlier. The curved metal reminded him of the scoops he used back home for barley and corn. He liked the way its shape caught light. He liked how the curve formed a predictable arc. On a farm he learned to compare small shifts in that curved line to shifts in the horizon. That old habit resurfaced now miles from Ohio. He took the scoop back to his mortar pit and began experimenting. He set it on the ground, checked the angle of its lip, and studied how its curve changed when he moved it slightly. He placed small wooden pegs around it to mark incremental traverse adjustments. The scoop became a visual anchor. The pegs formed a measurable pattern. He believed he could create a repeatable system for micro-corrections that standard equipment could not provide. The men in his section teased him at first. They liked him, but they thought the idea looked strange. A grain scoop did not belong in a war. Miller ignored the remarks. He understood terrain more deeply than anyone else in the battalion. When he looked across a valley, he did not see slopes and trees. He saw tilt angles, water flow paths, elevation drops, and distance compression caused by fog. He built his system slowly. Each day he tested small adjustments and compared impacts with the unit's sighting instruments. He recalibrated peg spacing. He scratched new reference lines inside the scoop. He waited for cloud cover, then checked how diffused light affected the curve. He recorded results quietly. Enemy pressure increased through the second week of June. German scouts became more active. They moved through the upper tree line during dawn patrols. They transmitted artillery coordinates within minutes. The Allied company on Miller's flank reported 3 casualties from a rapid strike that came shortly after a scout signal. Everyone understood that the scouts had to be neutralized before they caused a larger bombardment. On June 18, a forward observer spotted unusual movement near a ridge almost a kilometer away. 5 German scouts crawled behind a granite rise and began setting up a position believed to contain a radio link. The observer called for mortar fire. The target was difficult. It sat at long range and low visibility. Standard firing tables could hit the general area, but not the tight cluster needed for a clean elimination. Missing would alert the scouts and force them deeper into cover. Miller stepped beside the mortar tube and studied the ridge through binoculars. He recognized the contour immediately. It was the kind of slope that gave crews trouble because its angle varied across a short distance. The ground dipped behind the ridge, creating a blind zone. He calculated that standard adjustments would land shells on the forward face instead of the hide behind it. He told his commanding sergeant that he wanted to use his improvised system. The sergeant hesitated. It felt strange to trust a farm tool over issued equipment. Time was limited. The scouts were already raising their antenna. Miller placed the grain scoop on the earth. He drove 3 pegs into the dirt in a pattern he built during weeks of tests. He moved the mortar tube by hair-thin increments while comparing its angle to the curve of the scoop. His hands were steady. He asked his crew to load. The first round fired. It arced over the valley and disappeared behind the ridge. A sharp crack followed. Dirt and smoke lifted in a tight plume. Miller made a micro-adjustment guided by the scoop's edge and peg markers. The next round dropped closer to the scouts and forced them to shift position. He saw the pattern forming. He saw how the ridge shape created distortion. He corrected again. His calm tone guided his crew while German scouts scrambled to reposition. The 4th round landed inside the blind zone and forced a radio operator to dive. The 5th landed seconds later. The ridge erupted in a concentrated blast. When the smoke cleared, the scouts were down. 5 bodies lay across the granite rise. No radio signal escaped the site. The company realized that Miller's improvised method had done what firing tables could not do in that terrain. Word spread quietly along the line. Men who once dismissed the grain scoop now asked him for advice. His technique became a small legend inside the unit, known only to those who saw its precision. The hours after the strike carried a steady tension across the Allied line. German artillery failed to appear. Officers took that silence as confirmation that the scouts had been neutralized before they could send coordinates. Miller's crew cleaned the mortar tube while discussing the shot sequence they had just executed. They replayed each adjustment. They tried to understand how such small angular changes produce such accurate results across such a long distance. The scoop sat beside the pit. A thin layer of dust clung to its surface. The pegs stood in the ground in the exact pattern Miller had used before the final corrections. The setup looked simple, but every placement represented weeks of quiet study. He had learned which angles mattered in mountain terrain and which illusions fooled the eye. His crew began asking him about the principles behind the system. They wanted to know how he read slopes and why he trusted the curved metal edge. Miller explained that farming forced him to understand natural tilt without instruments. His family operated on uneven land. They measured irrigation routes by watching how water pooled. They predicted harvest losses by tracking how rows held moisture. A grain scoop was a constant tool in those fields. Its curve gave him a reference for subtle changes. When the lip aligned with a certain horizon angle, he knew how much a slope dropped. That instinct returned the moment he held the scoop in Italy. The commanding sergeant approached the pit that afternoon. He carried a clipboard containing the morning's fire report. He wanted to know if Miller could repeat those results under different weather conditions. Miller said he could. He walked the sergeant through the peg spacing and how the curve of the scoop corresponded to elevation changes. The explanation sounded unusual, but the evidence on the ridge told its own story. During the next 2 days, the crew performed controlled tests. They fired at predetermined markers on various hillsides. Results were recorded and compared against standard firing table calculations. Miller's method consistently produced closer grouping patterns on complex terrain. The improvement was not dramatic on flat ground, but Italy had little flat ground. Officers noticed that his system compensated for terrain distortion that caused most misses during the campaign. The company began integrating his process informally. Mortar crews watched him work and adjusted their own aiming stakes. Some carved reference notches into spare metal plates. Some built their own peg patterns using scrap wood. Rumors spread to nearby platoons that a farmer had created a method to overcome the Italian ridgelines. Miller disliked attention, but he understood the importance of sharing the technique. He wanted fewer wasted rounds. He wanted fewer men exposed to counter-battery fire. By late June, German activity increased. Their forward observers moved more cautiously. They shifted to higher elevation points to avoid being fixed by Allied fire. This created new challenges. The scouts occupied positions that were almost invisible from standard observation posts. Valleys masked movement. Fog created false impressions of height. Miller studied each terrain report carefully. He tried to prepare new peg patterns that matched those ridgelines. One evening, the battalion intelligence officer visited the company command tent. He carried reports from aerial reconnaissance showing increased German radio traffic in the sector. Analysts believed that enemy artillery units were preparing coordinated strikes against supply routes. Modernizing observation positions was part of that effort. The officer wanted all mortar crews ready to counter any scout movement. Miller listened quietly and reviewed the map after the briefing. He studied the contour lines and imagined how elevation would distort sighting angles. 2 days later, the line received confirmation that German scouts were building new hides. A forward observer near a distant orchard sent a message saying that he saw movement behind a stone wall at long range. The position was nearly impossible to hit with standard corrections. The wall sat behind a shallow depression that tricked angle calculations. The observer needed mortar support before the scouts finished their setup. Miller moved to the mortar pit with his crew. He brought the scoop and set it on the ground. He drove new pegs into the soil in a pattern he designed during map study the night before. His crew trusted him now. They no longer questioned the presence of a farm tool beside military equipment. They simply waited for instructions. The forward observer relayed distance estimates and the approximate height of the wall. Miller used binoculars to confirm terrain shape. He saw the same distortion pattern that caused the ridge problem earlier in the month. He made initial corrections and ordered the first round. The shell disappeared into fog. The impact was short. Miller rotated the tube by a small amount and shifted one peg half an inch. The second round hit closer. German scouts scattered behind the wall. The observer confirmed that they were still present. Miller made a final adjustment by studying how light curved across the scoop's edge. The third round struck the exact depression behind the stone wall. The blast forced the scouts to break position. They tried to retreat. Miller ordered a quick follow-up shot. The fourth round landed among them and ended the threat. This second success pushed his method into wider company knowledge. Officers began considering ways to integrate his approach into training sessions. They noted that the scoop gave soldiers a stable visual anchor when fog or smoke obscured terrain. The peg patterns offered repeatable micro-adjustments. The technique reduced ammunition waste and increased reliability under stress. Despite this recognition, Miller stayed focused on the work. He did not talk about legacy or innovation. He wanted accuracy during the next engagement. He knew that the German army relied heavily on forward observers to guide their artillery. Removing scouts before they transmitted coordinates saved lives across the line. His civilian habits had become military advantages. He believed that practical knowledge mattered more than strict adherence to issued tools. The grain scoop remained with him each day. It developed small dents from transport. Its surface became darker from dirt and smoke. The pegs changed shape as he refined spacing. His system evolved quietly with each engagement. The crew now recognized that those tiny corrections often meant the difference between a clean hit and a dangerous miss. They learned to read terrain through his perspective. They began noticing small shifts in horizon angle that they once ignored. Early July brought heavier rain across the Apennine foothills. Soil softened. Slopes turned slick. Mortar crews struggled to keep their pits stable. Tubes sank by millimeters with each recoil. Those tiny shifts produced large errors at long distance. German scouts used the weather to their advantage. They moved during storms and hid in tree lines that blended with the mist. Miller understood these problems before others noticed them. Farming taught him how saturated soil behaved. He could judge ground stability from the way water pooled around boot prints. His crew watched him kneel in the mortar pit during rain showers and test soil firmness with the heel of his hand. He predicted which patches would hold the tube and which would collapse under repeated firing. This knowledge prevented several misfires. The crew learned to pack dirt in certain patterns based on his instructions. The battalion commander visited the company one morning during a temporary lull. He wanted a direct demonstration of Miller's system under wet conditions. He observed while Miller set the scoop on damp ground and aligned the curved lip with the faint horizon. The commander asked technical questions. He wanted to understand how a simple farming tool could outperform standard aiming stakes in such terrain. Miller explained again that the scoop served as a steady visual reference that ignored terrain illusions. When terrain distorted perceived angles, the curved metal remained constant. The demonstration impressed the commander. He left with a recommendation that similar field expedient methods be tested across other mortar sections. His report noted that improvised techniques sometimes outperformed official equipment in irregular landscapes. Still, there was no formal adoption. Logistics favored standardization. Field command preferred consistency. Miller accepted this reality. He did not design his method for recognition. He designed it to protect his crew from counterfire. Later that week, a German reconnaissance team infiltrated an abandoned farmhouse on a distant ridge. They set up a crude observation post in the upper window. The location gave them a clear view of Allied troop movement on the supply road. If they transmitted coordinates, artillery would fall on the route within minutes. The forward observer called for immediate mortar fire but warned that the target was deceptive. The farmhouse sat on uneven ground that caused horizontal error in most calculations. Miller examined the ridge through binoculars. He recognized the angle distortion instantly. The farmhouse leaned slightly due to old settling, and this tilt misled the eye. He prepared a new peg arrangement with ultra-fine spacing. The scoop went down again. The crew waited for his corrections. The first round flew wide. The second struck a small cluster of rocks near the ridge. Miller recalibrated quickly. His calm tone guided the adjustments. The third round hit the lower wall of the farmhouse. The fourth crashed through the upper window. The blast ended the reconnaissance attempt before coordinates escaped the building. After that strike, neighboring platoons began requesting instruction. They wanted to learn how Miller set the pegs, how he chose the scoop angle, and how he compensated for terrain illusions. He held brief sessions during downtime and shared his observations. Soldiers gathered around him in small circles and listened while he pointed at nearby slopes and explained how light played tricks on the eye. He taught them to trust stable references rather than instinct. His lessons were practical and free of technical jargon. They came from lived experience, not from manuals. German pressure intensified again by mid-July. Their artillery units tried to regain initiative. They launched intermittent barrages to disrupt Allied supply movements. Miller's company experienced 2 near hits within a single afternoon. Officers suspected that a scout team had found a new elevated perch. The forward observer searched the ridgeline and finally spotted a brief glint near a cluster of cypress trees. It was the reflection from a radio plate. That confirmed a new observer post. Distance estimates placed the target at the upper range of their mortar capability. Standard aim would likely scatter rounds across the slope. The crew prepared to fire. Miller studied the location. He analyzed the subtle darkness beneath the tree cluster. He measured shadow length to estimate slope gradient. He aligned the scoop with the true horizon and placed a new set of pegs with extreme precision. This formation used tighter spacing than any previous pattern. When the first round fired, it landed long. Miller shifted the tube by a fraction. The second round hit short. The third round closed the gap. The fourth struck the exact patch of shadow where the glint had appeared. The observer reported a direct hit. A follow-up shot removed any remaining movement. German artillery ceased for the rest of the afternoon. During the evening meal, Miller sat with his crew under a canvas shelter. Rain tapped consistently on the fabric. The men talked about the past weeks. They talked about casualties avoided because scouts never transmitted coordinates. They talked about how strange it felt that a grain scoop had become part of their equipment. One man joked that the army would list it as official gear if they saw enough results. Miller smiled but said nothing. He remembered his father teaching him to judge land by watching where water settled during storms. That memory stayed with him while he looked at the muddy slopes of Italy. On the next morning, the company received updated intelligence. Several German units were preparing a coordinated counterattack. Scouts were moving again and attempting to open observation channels across various ridges. The Allied line needed every mortar crew on maximum readiness. Officers emphasized that a single missed correction could expose the entire sector. Miller used the remaining hours of daylight to refine his system. He tested peg patterns for different horizon lines. He used the scoop to simulate angle changes created by midday glare. He drew rough sketches in dirt for younger soldiers who wanted to understand how to read terrain more accurately. His calm teaching style built confidence in the unit. Soldiers who once relied only on issued equipment now trusted their ability to interpret slopes using Miller's method. By early evening, tension along the line rose again. Radio chatter suggested that a new team of German scouts had entered a fold of land near a narrow ravine. The position was almost invisible from most angles. It allowed a clear view of the road leading to the supply column. If they transmitted coordinates, the next artillery strike would hit that route. The forward observer needed immediate support. He stated that the target area suffered from a severe depth illusion that caused previous rounds to fall short. Miller grabbed the scoop. He moved to the mortar pit and studied the ravine. He recognized the same pattern he saw on farms when sunlight created false impressions of ditch depth. He set the scoop down. He placed the pegs in a new configuration adapted for steep vertical distortion. The crew prepared rounds without speaking. They trusted his focus. He adjusted the tube carefully. The first round flew. The explosion was close but not exact. He made a correction by shifting a single peg. The second round hit the ravine wall. The third finished the job. The observer confirmed that the scouts had been eliminated. Late July brought a stretch of heavy fog across the sector. The valleys turned into pale corridors. Light flattened the land and erased depth. Mortar crews across the battalion struggled to read the ground. Even experienced observers misjudged distance by large margins. German scouts understood the advantage. They used the fog to shift positions, mark new routes, and prepare their artillery partners for fresh strikes. Miller worked through these conditions with the same calm focus he showed during earlier engagements. Fog did not change the scoop. The curve remained constant. Even when the horizon disappeared, the lip of the scoop held its angle. Miller taught the crew to use it as their primary reference when visibility dropped. He explained how fog softened contrasts and created false slopes. By ignoring the distorted landscape and trusting the curve, they retained better accuracy than other units in the area. The battalion noted this difference. Reports from other companies showed reduced effectiveness during the fog period. Miller's section maintained stable grouping patterns. Officers began to rely on his crew for high-precision tasks. They assigned them long-range observation point suppression whenever scouts appeared near distant ridgelines. The crew accepted the responsibility with quiet discipline. One morning during this fog period, a new threat emerged. Intelligence confirmed that a German platoon had established a concealed forward observation base on a high saddle between two ridges. The position was engineered carefully. It used rock cover, narrow firing slits, and a protected radio channel that made detection difficult. The only identified weakness was a shallow runoff channel that exposed the scouts when they shifted positions. The forward observer described the target as extremely challenging. Fog erased all fine details and turned the saddle into a flat silhouette. Miller studied the saddle through binoculars. He saw almost nothing. He recognized that the fog created a complete false flat. In reality, the slope dipped in 3 stages. He needed to align the mortar tube with the true angle, not the illusion. He set the scoop down and waited for a faint break in the fog. When a thin shaft of light touched the upper ridge, he aligned the scoop with that line and placed the pegs according to the angle. His crew prepared the ammunition. The first round flew silent through the mist. The explosion came several seconds later. It was wide. Miller corrected by shifting 2 pegs inward. The second round struck closer. The observer confirmed that rocks moved near the runoff channel. Miller adjusted again. The third round hit the saddle. The fourth landed inside the depression where the scouts moved. The base went silent. No radio signals followed. The position was neutralized. After that strike, the company commander assembled key NCOs for a short meeting. They reviewed Miller's performance across the month. They agreed that his technique provided unmatched accuracy in complex terrain and reduced waste during sustained operations. The commander reminded them that unofficial methods sometimes produced results superior to issued tools. He encouraged Miller to document his approach. Miller declined formal documentation. He said that each terrain feature required its own interpretation, and written guidelines might mislead crews who lacked field instincts. The commander accepted the decision. By early August, the battalion shifted positions during a planned advance. The landscape changed again. Instead of narrow ridges, the terrain opened into rolling slopes with terraced farmland. German scouts adapted quickly. They built small camouflaged hides among abandoned grape rows. Their radio transmissions became harder to track. They moved with the ease of men who understood the land. Miller recognized this pattern. He knew that scouts in agricultural terrain could exploit subtle grade changes that hid movement from a distance. The new terrain resembled parts of Ohio. It brought back memories of his father pointing to distant rows and explaining how a 1-degree tilt could hide a full length of crop from sight. Miller used those memories now. He studied each terrace. He looked at how shadow lines changed as clouds passed overhead. He placed new peg patterns that matched the gradual slopes. The crew learned to adapt quickly to the new environment. Several days into this advance, the forward observer reported a cluster of enemy scouts moving along a terrace on the far edge of a vineyard. The location sat beyond normal comfort range. The terrace curved slightly downward, which caused standard corrections to overshoot. The observer needed mortar fire before the scouts disappeared behind the next row. Miller set the scoop on the dry soil. He adjusted it for the downward curve. The pegs went into the ground in a long arc. The crew prepared. The first round sailed over the terrace. He shortened the angle. The second round struck the slope. The third round landed among the scouts. The observer confirmed casualties. The remaining scouts fled into deeper cover. As the battalion pushed farther into the region, the terrain grew more unpredictable. Vineyards alternated with pockets of rough ground and abandoned stone huts. German scouts shifted positions constantly. They used scattered cover to build temporary hides. The Allied line needed fast response to prevent artillery strikes against advancing infantry. Miller's crew remained in near continuous action, firing short sequences across multiple ridges. One evening the commander asked Miller how he managed to maintain focus under pressure. Miller replied that farming taught him patience and consistency. He said that land could not be rushed. It demanded careful observation. He explained that the same applied to mortar fire. Success came from reading the ground, not from force. The commander nodded and left him to his work. Later that night the forward observer detected movement on a far ridge near an old stone tower. The scouts used the tower as a partial screen. Their position allowed them to overlook a supply trail that the battalion needed to use at dawn. A strike was necessary before morning. Visibility was poor. Cloud cover hid the upper ridge. The observer warned that even small errors would cause rounds to land on the forward slope instead of the blind zone behind it. Miller examined the tower through the limited light. He saw almost none of the true landscape. He decided to rely entirely on the scoop. He placed it on the ground. He aligned the curve with the faint outline of the ridge. He drove the pegs in a tight formation that matched the predicted slope. His crew trusted him. They loaded the tube. The first round fired. The explosion echoed faintly behind the tower. Miller refined the angle. The second round struck closer. The third round hit directly. Stone fragments flew through the darkness. The tower went silent. The company understood again why Miller's method worked. He removed guesswork from terrain. He replaced instinct with stable reference points that ignored illusions. His approach reduced risk for advancing infantry and minimized wasted ammunition. It gave them an advantage in a campaign shaped by land, weather, and elevation. By mid-August the German army increased its reliance on long-range harassment fire. Their artillery units tried to disrupt Allied staging areas before each advance. Scouts worked in small teams and moved quickly across broken terrain. They often appeared for seconds at a time. If they transmitted coordinates, the result was immediate danger. Mortar crews had to respond with speed and precision. Misses cost lives. Miller understood that the window to strike was shrinking. His crew operated with near-constant readiness. They slept in shifts and kept ammunition stacked in careful rows. The mortar tube remained cleaned and packed after each short sequence. The scoop stayed beside Miller at all times. It had become part of his uniform. Its surface darkened from smoke and rain. The pegs filled a small pouch he carried on his belt. They were cut to exact lengths, based on patterns he refined through weeks of field trials. The battalion moved toward a village positioned on a multi-tiered slope. The terrain dropped in sudden steps. Each terrace contained stone walls built decades earlier. German scouts hid behind these walls and watched the Allied advance. The first barrage came shortly after sunrise. Allied infantry scattered for cover. The forward observer sent warnings that scouts were using the upper terraces to target the battalion. Mortar crews were ordered to counter fire immediately. Miller's crew moved into position. He studied the terraces. He saw how each step created a false plane. The eye read them as separate levels, but from long distance they blended into one continuous slope. This produced large errors in elevation adjustment. He set the scoop on firm ground and aligned it with the true horizon. He marked the terrace lines with new peg placements. He ordered the first round. It struck the lower terrace. He corrected. The second round hit the wall where the scouts had taken position. The third round silenced the location. The observer confirmed that no further signals came from that area. The battalion advanced again. New challenges appeared. The German scouts shifted to forest pockets above the village. Trees created additional illusions. Shadows masked slope direction. Branches broke up silhouettes. Rounds often landed short because tree lines hid the true depth of the target. Miller adapted quickly. He used the scoop to determine the angle beneath the shadowed canopy. He placed pegs according to the faint outline of the real ridge. His first sequence struck a cluster of scouts near the tree line. The crew fired 2 more rounds to finish the position. Later that afternoon the company encountered a steep ravine carved by old water flow. German scouts used the ravine edge as a hide. They could see the main road and report troop movement with precision. The forward observer warned that the ravine caused heavy depth distortion. He needed mortar fire fast. Miller assessed the ravine and recognized the illusion. The far edge appeared closer than it truly was. He set the scoop down and aligned the curve with the ridge shadow. His peg formation was tight and precise. The first round fired. It landed short. He made a single correction. The second round hit the ravine lip. The third followed and finished the job. The scouts were neutralized before they sent coordinates. Throughout these engagements word spread through the battalion. Soldiers from other companies spoke about the farmer who created a technique for precision fire in terrain that confused everyone else. They described his ability to read slopes that others did not see. They mentioned how his calm voice directed his crew even during heavy fire. Some talked about how his methods saved their positions from devastating artillery strikes. Despite the growing recognition, Miller stayed focused on his work. He approached each target as a new problem. He never reused peg patterns without adjustment. He explained to younger soldiers that terrain changes constantly. Soil shifts. Sunlight changes. Fog distorts. Trusting old patterns without observation risked failure. He encouraged them to study the land rather than memorize steps. One night near the end of August, the battalion prepared for a coordinated push toward a strategic highway. German defenses were expected to be strong. Scouts would be active across every ridge. The battalion commander called key NCOs to a planning tent. He explained that a single scout team had already been spotted near a stone embankment overlooking the route. They carried a portable radio set capable of transmitting quickly. If they lived long enough to report the Allied approach, the counter-battery strike would fall within minutes. The commander asked Miller for an assessment. Miller reviewed the map and studied the contour lines around the embankment. He highlighted a section where the ground dipped sharply. That depression would cause rounds to fall short if adjusted using standard values. He explained that the embankment created a shadow that hid the angle between two ridges. The commander approved a direct strike as soon as the forward observer confirmed exact position. Just after dawn, the observer reported visual contact. The scouts were taking cover behind the embankment. They had not yet raised the antenna. Time was extremely limited. Miller moved to the mortar pit with his crew. He set the scoop on the earth. He placed the pegs with deliberate speed. He aligned the tube. The first round fired. The explosion echoed short of the embankment. Miller made a precise correction. He shifted one peg by the width of a finger. The second round flew. It hit the embankment. The third round followed and ended the threat. The observer confirmed no further movement. That strike protected the entire battalion. Without it, the approach would have been exposed to heavy artillery fire. Officers noted the event in their reports. They described the accuracy as exceptional. They credited Miller's technique with preventing casualties during the final approach. As the battalion secured the highway, the pace of engagement slowed. The front shifted forward. Scouts retreated. Units reorganized and resupplied. During this pause, Miller repaired his equipment. He straightened the scoop's edge. He replaced worn pegs. His crew cleaned the tube and restocked ammunition. They talked about the past weeks. They talked about the pattern of engagements and how each adjustment mattered. They understood that precision came from discipline, not luck. During this lull, a junior officer approached Miller privately. He asked why Miller never requested formal recognition. He said that many men believed Miller deserved an award for his contributions. Miller replied quietly that farming taught him a simple lesson. Land does not care about recognition. Results matter. If a technique saves lives, then that is enough. The officer respected the answer and left the conversation there. September arrived with a shift in weather that changed the entire sector. The air turned cooler. Morning fog lifted faster. The land dried enough for artillery units to resume heavier operations. German scouts reduced their movements but continued to appear at critical points. They focused on supply intersections, hill paths, and narrow choke points that determined the timing of Allied advances. Mortar crews remained on constant alert. Miller used the quieter days to refine his system even further. He adjusted peg lengths after noticing how the early autumn light changed shadow angles across slopes. He tested the scoop's alignment against new terrain shapes revealed by receding foliage. His crew watched him work with the same focus they showed during combat. They understood that preparation during calm hours determined success when pressure returned. By mid-September, the battalion prepared for another major push. The campaign demanded continuous movement. Terrain became more mixed. Hills that had once been covered in heavy vegetation were thinning. Scouts adapted and used rocks, low walls, and drainage channels to conceal themselves. Miller studied each terrain report with more intensity than before. He knew that small errors could cost more lives as operations accelerated. One afternoon, a forward observer detected a small team of German scouts moving along a slope that overlooked a critical junction. The scouts were positioned behind a broken stone culvert. Its shape created an almost perfect depth illusion. The observer warned that standard fire would likely miss on both sides. The commander ordered a precision strike. He requested Miller's crew specifically. Miller placed the scoop on firm ground and checked the slight tilt of the earth beneath his feet. He aligned the lip with the distant ridge and matched the angle to what he believed was the true elevation of the culvert. He drove his pegs into the ground in a narrow arc. The first round fired. The explosion echoed short. He shifted the tube by a tiny amount. The second round flew. It hit the stones. A third followed and ended the threat. The road to the junction remained secure. As the battalion advanced toward higher terrain, the German army attempted to disrupt logistics by sending scouts deeper into rear areas. They targeted ammunition trails and medical routes. Mortar crews had to respond rapidly and often without full visibility. Miller's system became essential for hitting targets behind partial cover. He adapted his technique to new ridge shapes and new soil types. He explained to his crew how certain slopes reflected sound differently and how echo timing helped confirm distance. These small insights strengthened the crew's confidence. In late September, the battalion halted near a ridge line that marked a natural defensive point. The command expected a counter-thrust. Scouts moved frequently along the opposite ridge. They used dry gullies and stone terraces to shift positions without detection. During one late afternoon, the forward observer spotted 5 enemy scouts gathering near a fold of land that offered a direct view into the Allied line. Their presence was dangerous. They needed to be eliminated quickly. Miller studied the fold through binoculars. The land formed a narrow pocket that distorted elevation. He understood that any standard correction would fail. He placed the scoop on the ground. He checked the curve against the distant ridgeline. He set the pegs with careful precision. He ordered the first round. It struck the slope below the fold. He corrected slightly. The second round landed closer. He made one more adjustment. The third round dropped directly into the pocket. The explosion echoed across the ridge. A fourth round followed to ensure no one remained. The observer confirmed the elimination of the team. That strike ended a pattern that had threatened the entire line. Officers recognized how much depended on Miller's judgment. They noted the number of times his technique prevented artillery strikes in the previous months. They acknowledged that his approach was unconventional but consistently effective. Still, there was no formal directive to standardize the method. The Army valued uniform training. Field improvisation rarely entered manuals. During the final weeks of the campaign, Miller's role shifted. The battalion needed to prepare new crews for advancing operations. Miller was asked to instruct younger soldiers. He showed them how to judge slopes, how to identify depth illusions, and how to use simple objects as stable reference points. He explained that precision came from discipline, not from equipment alone. He encouraged them to trust observation over instinct. His lessons spread quietly across platoons. The scoop remained with him through the final phase of the Italian advance. It had dents from transport, scratches from stone, and dark patches from smoke. The pegs in his pouch showed marks from constant adjustment. They represented countless hours of field testing. The technique he created saved men who never learned his name. It prevented strikes that would have caused heavy casualties. It proved that simple civilian experience could reshape battlefield tactics when necessity demanded it. After the campaign ended, Miller returned to Ohio. He went back to the same land he once walked as a farmer. He rebuilt irrigation lines, repaired fences, and restored the fields that had been left unattended during the war. The scoop returned to its original purpose. It measured grain once more. He used it the way he had before the war, but the tool carried a different weight now. It reminded him of the men he served with and the terrain that tested them. It reminded him of long days where survival depended on reading the land accurately. He never sought recognition. He never told many people about what happened in Italy. His crew remembered. The officers who witnessed his work remembered. Some mentioned him in after-action reports. Most viewers of the future never read those lines. His technique stayed in the memories of those who saw it. It lived in the quiet knowledge that sometimes the most effective innovations are born from ordinary tools and the careful patience of a man who understands the land beneath his feet. The Italian campaign moved forward with the support of countless soldiers who fought in conditions that changed by the hour. Miller's contribution became one of many small acts of ingenuity that shaped the outcome. His method did not become official doctrine, but it influenced those who learned from him. It stood as proof that precision could come from unexpected sources and that a simple curve of metal could alter the course of a battlefield when placed in the hands of someone who knew how to read it. He carried that memory with him for the rest of his life. The grain scoop stayed in his barn. The pegs disappeared into a drawer. The lessons remained in his mind. When he looked across the fields, he saw the same angles he saw in Italy. The land did not change. Only the purpose did.